The sacred unfolding, a journey through the chambers of divine perception. The eternal question. In the beginning, and in every moment that echoes with the weight of existence, there dwells within the human heart an inexhaustible yearning, a longing that transcends the boundaries of flesh and time, reaching toward something vast, something ineffable, something that whispers in the silence between thoughts. This is the sacred hunger for understanding, the soul's eternal quest to embrace the totality of being itself. From the very dawn of consciousness, when the first spark of awareness illuminated the darkness of unknowing, humanity has stood at the threshold of mystery, gazing into the infinite expanse of existence with wonder-filled eyes. What is this phenomenon we call life? What invisible thread connects the beating heart to the turning stars? What ultimate reality pulses beneath the surface of all appearances, giving birth to mountains and moments, to dreams and dying leaves? These questions are not merely intellectual curiosities to be dissected by the calculating mind. They are the soul's native language, the prayers whispered by existence itself through the vessel of human consciousness. For to seek a total perception of one's space of existence is to engage in an act fundamentally religious, fundamentally sacred, an acknowledgement that behind the veil of phenomena lies something that cannot be named yet must be honored, cannot be grasped yet must be loved. Science, for all its magnificent achievements in illuminating the mechanisms of the material world, stands humbled before this ultimate question. It can measure the distance between galaxies, decode the language of genes, split the atom into its constituent parts, yet the deepest mystery remains. Why does anything exist at all? What is the source and meaning of this inexplicable gift of being? This is the realm where mysticism and religious perception dwell, where the soul ventures beyond the safe boundaries of empirical knowledge into the luminous darkness of direct experience, of spiritual insight, of union with the divine ground of all existence. The primordial unity, when heaven and earth were one. 500,000 years ago, as the earth turned through its ancient cycles and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, something extraordinary occurred. From the mists of pre-consciousness, from the twilight realm where instinct reigns supreme, humanity emerged, not fully formed, but awakening, like a dreamer becoming aware that they are dreaming. In those primordial days, when the first truly human souls walked beneath vast skies unmarked by names or borders, the world was experienced as one whole, an undivided mystery. There was no separation between the observer and the observed, no boundary where the self ended and nature began. The human being was a single note in the great symphony of existence, inseparable from the melody that flowed through all things. Nature in those days was not merely a collection of objects, not simply trees and rivers and animals to be catalogued and used. She was the Great Mother, the Holy Presence, the living mystery that breathed through every rock and root. She was unknowable yet intimately close, terrible in her power yet tender in her provision. Sometimes she offered her gifts with generous hands, ripe fruits, flowing waters, gentle rains that blessed the earth. At other times, she revealed her awesome face, in the lightning that split the sky, in the earthquake that shattered the ground, in the flood that swept away the familiar. Man did not stand apart from this mystery, analyzing it from a safe distance. He was cradled in her bosom, a child who knew himself to be part of the mother's body. When he died, he returned to her unknown depths, dissolved back into the sacred soil from which he had emerged. Birth and death were not transitions between separate realms but the rhythm of the Great Mother's breathing, the eternal cycle of emergence and return. This was the first phase of religious consciousness, the perception of nature as the sacred whole, the undivided one. In this perception, there was a profound wisdom, a knowing that later, more sophisticated ages would lose and struggle to recover. For in experiencing himself as part of nature's wholeness, primordial man touched something true. The fundamental unity of all existence, the web of interconnection that binds every particular thing to the infinite source. The first altars were not built of stone but of reverence. The first prayers were not words but silence filled with awe. The first priests were those who could feel most deeply their participation in the mystery, who could serve as conduits between their community and the Great Mother who sustained them all. The separation of heaven and earth. But consciousness, like a seed planted in dark soil, was destined to grow and unfold. As millennia passed and human awareness deepened, a great transformation occurred, a transformation that was simultaneously a gain and a loss, an awakening and a fall. Man began to perceive a division in reality itself. He noticed that some things were familiar, tangible, knowable, the earth beneath his feet, the daily round of labor and rest, the predictable patterns of seasons. These he placed low, in the realm of the everyday and the comprehensible. But there was something else, something that could not be touched or tamed, something vast and luminous and ultimately mysterious. This he placed high, in the realm of heaven, the distant throne of the sacred unknown. Thus emerged the great separation, heaven above and earth below, the transcendent and the immanent, the eternal and the temporal. No longer was the human soul simply a manifestation of Mother Nature's creative abundance. Now, it carried within itself something of a different order, a spark of the divine, a fragment of heaven's light, temporarily housed in a vessel of clay. This was both exile and promise. The soul remembered its celestial origin even as it walked the dusty paths of earth. It felt the ache of separation from its heavenly home, yet it also carried the dignity of its sacred lineage. Human life became a pilgrimage, a journey through the lower realm while maintaining connection to the higher truth. The religions of this second phase spoke in the language of ascent and descent, of the soul's journey from heaven to earth and its hoped-for return. They created elaborate cosmologies to map the distance between the human condition and the divine source. They developed practices of prayer and ritual designed to bridge the gap, to maintain the soul's connection to its celestial homeland even while it labored in the fields of time. In this perception, there was both truth and limitation. The truth was the recognition that human consciousness participates in something transcendent, something that cannot be reduced to material processes. The limitation was the hardening of this insight into a rigid dualism, a separation of heaven and earth that could lead to the devaluation of earthly existence, to the view that material reality was something to be escaped rather than transfigured. The dynamic creative force. As human consciousness continued its evolution, a new perception emerged from the depths of spiritual insight. The unknown heaven was no longer experienced merely as a distant, static realm of perfection. From within that infinite mystery, there arose the recognition of a dynamic element, a creative force that actively shaped and sustained existence. This was the birth of religions that envisioned the divine not as abstract being but as living power, gods and goddesses who embodied the dynamic aspects of cosmic creativity. The thunder god who wielded lightning, the fertility goddess who blessed the womb and the seed, the sun deity who brought light and life, These were not mere personifications of natural forces but profound mystical insights into the active, creative dimension of ultimate reality. The human soul, in this phase, recognized itself not simply as a passive exile from heaven but as a participant in the divine dynamism. Through ritual, through ecstatic dance, through sacred sexuality, through sacrifice and celebration, humanity sought to align itself with the creative force, to become a conduit for divine energy flowing into the world. This perception contained a crucial truth, that the Absolute is not static but eternally creative, not distant but intimately involved in the unfolding of existence. Yet it also carried a danger, the tendency to fragment the divine unity into competing powers, to lose sight of the single source from which all dynamic forms emerge. The emergence of divine mind. 3,000 years ago, as the wheel of history turned and human civilization reached new heights of complexity, consciousness took another evolutionary leap. The dynamic force was recognized as arising from something deeper still, the mental element, the divine intelligence that conceives and creates all things. This was the perception embodied in the great philosophical religions of antiquity, in the Hellenic tradition with its vision of Nous, the universal mind, in the Vedic seers' recognition of Brahman as consciousness itself, in the Chinese sages' apprehension of the Tao as the nameless source from which all names arise. The world in this vision became a four-dimensional space, the absolute unknown at the apex, the creative mind as its representative and manifestation, the dynamic forces that execute the mind's intentions, and finally the material realm where all divine conceptions take form. Human consciousness, understanding itself as participating in this mental dimension, could now engage in philosophy, in contemplation, in the direct inquiry into the nature of reality. This was the age when temples became schools of wisdom, when priests became philosophers, when ritual expanded to include meditation and dialectic. The human being was no longer merely a child of nature, or a soul exiled from heaven, or a vessel for dynamic divine forces. Now, he was a thinking being capable of ascending through knowledge to unity with the divine mind itself. The ancient mysteries flourished in this phase, Orphic, Pythagorean, Platonic, traditions that promised not blind faith but direct gnosis, immediate spiritual knowledge of the real. The initiate could journey through layers of reality, could purify his consciousness until it became transparent to the divine light, could achieve that supreme state where the individual mind dissolved into universal mind and knew itself as one with the eternal. The universal logos and the spirit of love. 3 millennia ago, yet another transformation occurred in the depths of religious consciousness. The divine mind was now perceived not merely as abstract intelligence but as logos, the creative word, the universal spirit that speaks existence into being through an act of infinite love. This was the perception that flowered most fully in Christianity, though echoes of it resounded through other traditions as well. The absolute unknown had revealed itself not just as power or mind but as spirit, as that which seeks relationship, which loves creation into being, which enters into the suffering and joy of existence itself. In this vision, the divine was no longer simply transcendent but also radically immanent. The Word became flesh, the infinite took finite form, the eternal entered time. This was not a diminishment of divinity but its fullest revelation, that ultimate reality is not cold abstraction but warm, living presence. Not distant judge but intimate companion, not merely the ground of being but the very heart that beats in all hearts. The spiritual path in this phase became one of participation in divine love, of allowing the universal logos to speak through one's life, of surrendering the small self to the indwelling spirit. Prayer became conversation, relationship with the divine. Ethics became not mere obedience to law but the natural expression of love flowing from union with the divine heart. This perception brought both profound insight and new challenges. The insight was that ultimate reality is not indifferent to creation but engaged with it, not impersonal force but personal presence. The challenge was the tendency toward exclusivism, the claim that this particular manifestation of the divine exhausted all possible revelations, that one path alone led to union with God. The supreme vision, being itself. Alongside and arising from these evolutionary phases, a supreme perception has emerged, one that existed in seed form from the beginning yet has only recently begun to flower fully in human consciousness. This is the vision of the fifth phase, the recognition of the Absolute not primarily as nature or heaven or force or mind or spirit, but as being itself, the pure existence from which all particular beings emerge and to which they eternally return. This is the perception embodied in Buddhism's teaching of emptiness that is simultaneously fullness, in Vedanta's realization of Brahman as Sat Chit Ananda, being consciousness bliss. In Taoism's understanding of the Tao that cannot be named yet is the mother of all things, in Orpheism and Platonism's vision of the one beyond all multiplicity. In this supreme perception, all dualities dissolve. Heaven and earth are recognized as two faces of one reality. Static being and dynamic becoming are seen as complementary aspects of the same. Mind and matter, spirit and flesh, transcendence and immanence, all opposites reconcile in the vast spaciousness of pure being. The mystic who attains this perception undergoes a radical transformation. No longer does he seek the divine as something separate from himself. He realizes his own deepest nature as identical with ultimate being. The drop discovers it was always the ocean. The wave knows itself as the sea. Individual consciousness recognizes itself as a local manifestation of universal consciousness, a temporary form through which the formless contemplates itself. This realization brings not pride but profound humility, not a sense of personal achievement but the dissolution of the very idea of a separate person who could achieve anything. What remains is simply being, aware of itself, expressing itself through this particular form and through all forms, dancing as the dance of existence itself. The evolution of the human soul. Parallel to this evolution of religious perception, there has been an evolution in humanity's understanding of itself, of the human soul and its place in the cosmic order. In the primordial phase, the human being knew itself as part of all nature, a strand in the great web. There was no sharp boundary between self and world, no rigid ego structure separating the individual from the whole. This was a state of participation mysticism, of fluid identity, of consciousness that flowed like water between different levels of reality. As religious consciousness evolved, so did self-consciousness. The human entity began to discern within itself different principles, a dynamic character, the life force that animates the body, a mental element, the capacity for thought and reflection that elevates humanity above mere biological existence, a universal nature, the soul's participation in something infinite and eternal. Each phase of religious evolution corresponded to a deepening of self-understanding. When heaven separated from earth, the soul recognized its dual nature, mortal body, immortal essence. When the dynamic force was perceived, the soul understood itself as animated by divine energy. When mind emerged as supreme, the soul realized its capacity for knowledge and wisdom. When spirit was revealed, the soul discovered its nature as love, as capacity for relationship with the divine. Finally, in the supreme perception of being itself, the soul undergoes the most radical transformation of all. It ceases to identify itself as a separate entity, whether mortal or immortal, earthly or heavenly, dynamic or mental. Instead, it recognizes its essential identity with ultimate being. The soul realizes that what it called I was never a separate thing but always a manifestation of the one being, a wave that was never separate from the ocean, a ray that was never separate from the sun. This is not the annihilation of individuality, but its transfiguration. The person continues to function in the world, to think and act and relate, but no longer from the perspective of an isolated ego defending itself against a hostile universe. Now, all action flows from the recognition of fundamental unity. All perception is colored by the awareness that everything encountered is a manifestation of the same being. All relationships are seen as the divine relating to itself through various forms. The present threshold. Today, at this particular moment in the long evolution of human consciousness, we stand at a threshold. The perception of the fifth phase, the recognition of being itself as the ultimate reality, is beginning to prevail in the depths of human awareness, even as the surface of civilization often seems dominated by materialism and fragmentation. This shift is not merely an intellectual development, but a transformation in the structure of consciousness itself. More and more individuals are having direct experiences of unity with being, spontaneous moments when the boundaries of the separate self dissolve and what remains is vast, luminous, peaceful presence. This presents both opportunity and challenge for the world's religious traditions. Those religions that remain fixated in earlier phases, that insist on rigid dualities between heaven and earth, that cannot move beyond anthropomorphic images of God, that maintain exclusive claims to truth, will find themselves increasingly unable to speak to souls awakening to the supreme perception. But religions and spiritual philosophies that can adapt to the spirit of the fifth phase, that can reinterpret their symbols and teachings in light of the recognition of being itself, these will survive and flourish. Christianity can discover the mystical heart it always contained, reading the Incarnation not as a unique historical event, but as the eternal truth that being always manifests in form, that the divine always dwells within creation. Buddhism, Vedanta, Taoism, and other wisdom traditions of the fifth phase will continue to guide seekers toward direct realization of their essential nature. The key to this adaptation is not the abandonment of earlier insights but their integration into a more comprehensive vision. The primordial perception of unity with nature, the second phase's recognition of transcendence, the third phase's honoring of dynamic creativity, the fourth phase's emphasis on mind and spirit, all these contain truth. They are not errors to be discarded, but stages in an evolution, rungs on a ladder that need not be kicked away once climbed. The ineffable mystery. As this exploration draws to a close, one truth shines with particular clarity, that for all our evolution in perception, for all our deepening understanding, the ultimate reality remains forever ineffable, forever beyond the grasp of concepts and words. We can speak of being itself, but what we point to exceeds all our speaking. We can describe phases of religious evolution, but the mystery that drives this evolution remains ultimately unknowable. We can trace the journey of the soul toward union with the divine, but the actual moment of union dissolves all the maps and categories by which we tried to navigate. This is not a counsel of despair but an invitation to humility and wonder. The mystical path is not finally about accumulating knowledge or achieving states of consciousness. It is about surrendering into the mystery, about allowing oneself to be dissolved in the vast ocean of being, about resting in the silence that lies beneath and beyond all words. In that silence, there is peace. Not the peace of a solved puzzle but the peace of ceasing to struggle, of accepting that one is held by something infinitely greater than oneself, of trusting in the intelligence that guides the stars and the seasons and the evolution of consciousness itself. May all beings come to rest in this peace. May all souls awaken to their true nature as manifestations of the One Being. May the evolution of religious consciousness continue until all of humanity recognizes itself as the divine contemplating itself through infinite forms. In the end, we return to the beginning, to that primordial sense of participating in a sacred whole. But now, the return is not regression but fulfillment. Now, we embrace unity not from unconsciousness but from the heights of awareness. Now, we know ourselves as both the droplet and the ocean, the particular and the universal, the mortal form and the immortal being. This is the sacred unfolding, the eternal journey of consciousness discovering itself. This is the mystical truth that was always present, waiting to be recognized. That being is, that consciousness shines, that love embraces all. That the mystery we sought was never far away but closer than breathing, nearer than our own heartbeat, identical with our deepest nature. Om Shanti. Peace. Amen.